This is where we start looking ahead to preseason game number 2. I'd like to say we're entering the end of the first half of preseason, but really it's kind of crossing that threshold because it's just 3. Jaguars joint practices are incoming, so Lions will get to have joint practices with another team. And I think, Ryan, the big difference when we get to the preseason game itself, though, is going to be that we might get to see Teddy Bridgewater, which, considering one of our handouts for hurt his spot the most on the roster from game 1 was Nate Sudfeld, I think, Teddy Bridgewater is going to open up what they can show you in a preseason game and get better passes out there to guys like Jameson Williams and Jahmyr Gibbs, so the rookies can learn a little bit better on the fly getting ready for the NFL.
Yeah, again, a really tough situation because Nate Sudfeld just got put into this situation, right? Like he had somebody come in who is a veteran guy, has been in the league for 10 years, has overcome so much in his career, right, Chris? I mean, the guy almost died in Minnesota, and he was coming off a Pro Bowl year, and there was a lot of hope for him, and still comes back to football. And you have a guy who makes a difference on the days that aren't Sunday, but you also have a guy who can make a difference on Sunday if for whatever reason Jared Goff is out. And again, Meko, I think the biggest benefactor of Teddy Bridgewater coming to Detroit and rocking that number 50 jersey while he waits for a single digit to come his way. I think the guys who are the biggest benefactors are the Chase Cotas, the Dylan Drummonds, the Maurice Alexanders of the world, the Trinity Bensons, right? That are going to get a fairer shot because they're going to have a reliable quarterback who's throwing the ball much better than Nate Sudfeld could.
Let's not dance around it. Jameson Williams is probably going to benefit the most. And at the time of this recording, like we haven't all heard like the full interview of Teddy Bridgewater, but the little bit that I heard in the quotes that I've read, it almost feels like Teddy's coming in and making it his like personal responsibility to get Jamo like right. And I'll say right in quotes, right? To get him to a point of really like realizing his full potential. And that is something. So Ryan, you talked about this in the last segment as like a couple people that probably like weren't really enthused about this move. I was one of those people because it was just like, while I expected, and I was perfectly fine with Teddy bringing this next level of leadership and accountability to like the next tier of guys, I just didn't know like who would necessarily benefit from that. And Teddy's kind of come out on day 1 and been like, no, Jamo's my guy. And he didn't just talk about it. He actually did it on the field, where after the Lions had practice today, who's on the field practicing and like still getting some reps in together? Teddy and Jamo. And that's stuff that, not saying that Goff wouldn't do, but he can't do at this point. Like he has other things that are going to be on his mind. He has other responsibilities. And so for Teddy to basically make that his responsibility and say like, no, I'm going to get this guy right. I'm going to work on his timing. I'm going to work on this, and have a veteran guy who probably, again, trying not to dance around too much, maybe just speaks a different language that Jamo gets a little bit better. I think that's really who's going to benefit the most from having Teddy Bridgewater around, going into these joint practices and this second preseason game.
Yeah, I think that just the impact can't really be stated enough, and obviously we just need to wait for him to take the field and everything. Looking at joint practices themselves, though, who is the guy I think, Ryan, you want to see more out of? I think in my mind, like, Jameson Williams, an easy answer here. I would say that I'd like to see Sam Laporta getting more involved again. Obviously didn't have a great showing in the first preseason game. I think there's some time for him. The tight end position, though, is flexible enough that he doesn't need to be like great out of the gate, but I think you have put a lot of stock into him for what he can do for you, and I think, I think he's the one I want to see the coaches working with the most as we get closer to the season, just because Ben Johnson was a tight ends coach. If we're going by a lot of the rumors, the Lions hope that if Ben Johnson leaves, the tight ends coach there becomes the next offensive coordinator. But this is a tight ends driven offense. It doesn't mean the tight ends are the focus, but it's being run by a lot of guys who either played tight end or understand the tight end position. And I feel like when you draft a guy like Sam Laporta, you should be able to spend some more time to get him ready for the NFL.
Yeah, Laporta's he's a very important piece to the puzzle this year. You know, him and Gibbs were drafted as high as they were because they're expected to be contributors on day one. So you want to see some more out of Sam Laporta this week. I'm on board with you. For me personally, I want to cheat and throw out two names. So sorry, Meko, you're going last. But one is Julian Okwara. We just talked about him, and I think he's a guy who, again, he has to stack not another good practice, not another, good quarter and a half of tape when the Lions play the Jaguars. It needs to be like an everyday thing with that guy. And, you need to see him take steps in the right direction over the course of this next week against Jacksonville. My other guy, we haven't talked about him at all. Levi Onwuzurike had himself a nice little game on Friday in a limited showing. He barely played, I think, over double-digit snaps. But that's a guy that I want to see on the field, making his case, stamping his ticket to the 53-man roster along the interior of that defensive line. If he can have another standout performance, I think he was the highest graded player behind Jack Campbell for the Lions, according to PFF. But if Levi is pressuring the quarterback like he did on Friday, if he's doing it again on Saturday against the Jaguars, all of a sudden the Lions might have some things going in their direction with those players.
No, that's a good call out, Ryan. Like, Levi is someone that we, like you said, we didn't get to talk about, but he's just as deserving as being like kind of shouted out for having a really good performance. Even if we're not even talking about the fact of him coming back from that injury, just the actual performance he put on display in that preseason game was just something to like kind of really acknowledge, considering, we haven't gotten to see a lot of him play. But if there's one player that like I'm looking at as far as like, hey, like, let's see how you're going to respond going into this next, set of joint practices and preseason game, it's actually James Houston. Like, Julian gave you his best shot. He went out there and let it all hang out. And he's in a good position to like double down on it. Like, Julian doesn't have to go out and get another 3-sack performance. If Julian goes out there and has just like another sack and like plays against the run really well, I can see how this like whole camp battle could start to shift in his favor. So if you're James Houston, you need to showcase that you can do more than just rush the passer. You have to show the ability to get out there and defend against the run. And yeah, at the same time, when you get your opportunities to rush the passer, stay on your feet. Don't eat grass or eat turf in those situations, because you never know if you might get yanked from that series, and the guy that comes in behind you might do the thing that you were trying to do. So James has a big week coming up for him just to keep this battle alive and honestly to keep it in his favor.
I think the other battle that needs to be stated, and again, we talked about this on the last segment too, so we're going to just keep going back to it, but I need to see more offensive linemen stand out in this depth at this point. I'll have two things here. I'll say that I need to see more offensive linemen stand out this depth. I'm kind of running out of time to see someone who can push Matt Nelson, and I'm not sure that the future of playing Sorsdal is going to be at tackle. You really hope it's going to be someone like Eze or another great performance out of Ifedi. So there needs to be some improvements there. And the other one I really want to see is, I thought Broderick Martin played well in his first outing, but I feel with the questions around where he was drafted and like how, like, we've seen a lot of hype around Martin, Ryan, but I don't think one game is going to convince me that Martin is all that yet. But if he puts a second game together, then that sizzle starts to we're starting to make fajitas now.
Yeah, I think that kind of goes back to the point I was making about Levi, is that you had another guy who, splashed, Benito Jones. He had a sack, and you all of a sudden have a camp battle there yourself with the interior defensive line. Not saying that Broderick Martin isn't going to make the roster. That's not what I'm saying at all.
Yeah, he's making the roster. It's just a matter of where in that depth.
Right. Yeah. I mean, do they decide that they go another route and they keep Levi and they keep Benito and you know they don't keep somebody at another position because they want that interior defensive line depth. I can't see them bringing all these players. So I guess that comes back to my earlier point of there's just going to be some players that are going to end up being cut that are they were good enough to make the roster in past years for the Detroit Lions, but this year it's a different roster. The talent's been elevated, and you're going to have to win that job. And Broderick Martin not at a crossroads, does not have to worry about not making the roster. But hey, Levi Onwuzurike, you play big. You can prove that you can be an A+ run defender or something like that. This coaching staff's going to have no qualms about playing you over Broderick Martin.
I mean, I agree with you, Ryan. I think at the end of the day, though, it's with some of these camp battles like you're talking about, this is just a good problem for the Lions to have in general. If you're
Great
talking
problem.
about, right, because at this point in time, we're talking about just snap counts, right? Like Broderick's going to play. It's just a matter of like, okay, can you continue to progress and develop throughout camp and preseason for
Right.
us to play you a lot, you know,
Yep.
to play you on third down situations? Because we know, like, based on how they felt about Isaiah Buggs and the snaps he played, Broderick's going to play. He's going to get those reps in. But Levi starts to come in there as a third down option, and now you start looking at your third down packages probably a lot differently. And, you know, where do you fit in a Broderick Martin? Where do you fit in a Josh Pascal? Where do you fit in a John Kaminsky? This just becomes, like I said, it sounds like a problem, but it should be like something that Aaron Glenn should be just like, you know, rubbing his hands together about, because it's like, yo, I'm going to be able to be very creative with my defensive fronts.